Thank you all for being here. I think I know most of you. Those of you I do not know, I do see some new faces. Can I see a hand of who is not an Asian Society Hong Kong member? Wow. Okay, you guys, you need to be a member. And the reason is we really have great programs this last 6 months. I mean, things are ballistic, going, speakers and so on and so forth. If you're a member, you get first div, and especially if you're a President Circle member, which is higher tier of individual member, then you get invited to, for example, last Friday, we were able to put together a really last minute President Circle and corporate member dinner with Professor Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia. And that got put together in less than a week. And so membership does have its privileges here at Asia Society Hong Kong. And so please consider joining a member. And I think we're offering some really wonderful discounts if you join 3-month free. And the reason is, I think Hong Kong is back. I think those of you who were in Hong Kong last week know how crazy with all the conferences, summits, the sevens, the art fairs. We are getting visitors, and a lot of visitors. And sometimes these wonderful speakers will contact us and want to use Asia Society to speak to an audience, like all of you. So becoming a member, you will get first dibs. And if ticket sells out, we will give members priority. And so please consider, the way I look at it, the crazier the world is, the more popular we are. And really has been like that especially this last 3 months. And so that's why I can't sell the membership enough. And it is really, the quality of the speakers are also quite unique. And it's because Asia Society Hong Kong is part of a network of 16 centers around the world. And this afternoon, we have a wonderful honor of hearing from our Managing Director of Asia Society DC office, my wonderful colleague, Wendy Cutler. And Wendy is the expert on what tariff. She helped negotiate TPP, some of the trade, U.S.-China, U.S.-Korea. I think her illustrious career of 30 years in this field, again, only you can get this at Asia Society Hong Kong. And tomorrow, we have a wonderful program featuring 3 of our global trustees. The Asia Society global trustees are meeting this next couple of days here at Asia Society Hong Kong. So we're taking advantage of Wendy being here, our president, Dr. Kyung-Hwa Kang, and as well as Ambassador Cheng Hong-chi, who is our global co-chair. Ambassador Chen is already in from Singapore. We have Vali Nasser, Professor Vali Nasser from Hopkins. Professor Nasser at Hopkins will be a speaker tomorrow, as well as colleague Jing, who runs our ASPE in New York. So it's quality programs like this that I'm really, really delighted that Asia Society Hong Kong can host. And so that's one of the reasons you kind of want to become members. Then also, that's just the business and policy side of it. And the arts and cultural side of it is really also quite unique. And so just those of you who have time, we have a really interesting 2 sculptures. As you exit, instead of walking here, go to the courtyard. There are 2 sculptures that are really some really interesting stories from Art Institute of Chicago. Those of you who are familiar with the Art Institute of Chicago, they have some wonderful artwork, and they have an interesting project. And this pop-up exhibition literally popped up on Friday, and I asked if we can keep the sculpture for a couple of days to show off to our colleagues, our trustee. They said yes. So until Wednesday, those 2 unique sculptures are in the back there, and once you see the sculpture and find out the story behind it, you'll be really glad you did. So with that, I'm really delighted. Wendy is going to give us the tariff story, what's going on in Washington, and decipher and what is happening in Washington today. And I don't know who brought this weather. I don't know. I don't want to blame Wendy or those of you coming from New York. This weather is unusual, and so those of you who are coming from New York or DC, I think it's supposed to warm out in a couple of days, but the hospitality, the warm hospitality of Hong Kong is here. And we're really delighted. Stella Yifan from correspondent of Nikkei Asia, who is going to be our moderator today. And she has an illustrious career besides Nikkei Asia, also Wall Street Journal. And she's going to be a Hong Konger, official Hong Konger soon after her 7 years. So thank you, Stella, for agreeing to moderate today's discussion. And with that, I'm going to hand it to our two speakers to get the program started. Thank you.
Okay, I guess this mic is on already. Yes.
Hello.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for coming. Thanks so much for your time and bracing the cold weather. Hopefully we have a heated discussion that can warm up the temperature a little bit. So it's a great honor to be sitting down with Wendy, who's the one of the top trade experts in the U.S. Wendy, we're so close to the April 2nd, which Trump describes as a liberation day. It's the day when his administration is expected to announce a raft of reciprocal tariffs on not just top 15 countries, not just top 15 trading partners with the U.S., but literally every other country. Can you walk us through what is reciprocal tariff? What's that about, and what should we expect on that day?
Well, sure, and thanks, Stella, for joining me today on the stage, and a big thanks to Alice Mong and her staff here at the Asia Society Hong Kong Center. I have not been back here since COVID, and I forgot how just beautiful it is here, and so glad to be here this afternoon. So, reciprocal tariffs. Well, the first thing I would say about reciprocal tariffs is that at a very general level, they make sense, right? And the thinking behind them is, in a real-life example, the U.S. has a tariff of 2.5% on autos. Europe has a 10% tariff on autos. And so President Trump is saying that's unfair. We should have equal tariffs. And so the notion of reciprocal tariffs is to equalize the tariff rates between the United States and our trading partners. Where it gets really complicated, however, is in the implementation. How do you take a policy at this level and actually implement it? And just to give you a sense is that, for example, in our tariff schedule, there are over 10,000 product lines. And then you multiply that by, let's say, 200 countries, and you can imagine how detailed a reciprocal tariff policy could be. Clearly, we can't implement something like that. And so up until about 24 hours ago, there seemed to be a consensus around the idea of pick the countries with whom you have the largest trade deficits, the largest gaps in tariff differentials, hit those countries with one rate. So in other words, and this is just examples, country X might get a 10% rate, country Y might get a 20% rate. And that's where I thought we were headed, but overnight it seems that our president thinks that the policies that his team has come up with are too complicated, and he's asked for something that's simple and cleaner. And now it seems that he's favoring what's called a universal tariff, and that would mean the same tariff rate for all countries, not just a small group of countries, and the number 15 was used, but come up with a tariff rate against all countries that you could implement and the public would understand.
I guess that brings us to the second question, really. These days we can't hear about Trump without mentioning the word tariffs. He has called himself a tariff man. He seems to view it as the ultimate solution to many economic problems. He even said tariff is one of the most beautiful words in a dictionary. So what do you think Trump is ultimately trying to achieve by using, the tariffs as a tool? Is he just trying to level the playing field, or is he looking at tariffs as a mechanism to improve fiscal income for the government, or it's simply a pinpoint to force other countries to negotiate with the U.S.?
And I guess the answer is all of the above, plus a couple of more objectives. And depending on the day, he will point to a different objective. So, for example, as you mentioned, one is negotiating leverage. And the idea being if you hit a country with a tariff or you threaten a tariff, they may come to you and say, wait, we don't want that tariff. What do you want from us? We'll go ahead and make some concessions. And to be honest, we're seeing that now. India, for example, has lowered some tariffs. Europe and the UK are talking about getting rid of their digital services tax, and there are other examples. So negotiating leverage. But that assumes that a tariff is that you either impose it or threaten it, and then you would lift it. This is at cross purposes with another objective that he has, and that is to use tariffs to raise revenue, particularly given the significant tax cuts he wants to pursue under U.S. law. In order to, spend government money, you need to show where you're saving it. But it doesn't stop there. He also says tariffs are necessary to equalize trade, get rid of unfair trade practices, narrow trade deficits. And he also, frankly, is using tariffs to achieve what I would call non-trade objectives. So just overnight, for example, he was not happy that Putin in Russia, hasn't been playing nice on him achieving his ceasefire, and he threatened tariffs against countries that are buying Russian oil, which is, very little to do with trade, and more to do with trying to achieve other geopolitical aims. So again, many objectives, and some, frankly, are at cross purposes.
And in terms of tariffs this time around, we've noticed that he seems to be acting really tough on Canada and Mexico, which are, traditionally U.S. allies. Why is he doing this? Do you see it as a tactic for the U.S. to kind of pressure those countries so that they can more side with the U.S. and take stands against China?
Yeah, I think we all were a bit surprised by how focused he has been on Canada and Mexico, not only our two neighbors and close allies, but countries with whom we have a free trade agreement, the USMCA. When he initially threatened and then imposed certain tariffs and then took them off and then put some of them back on, his concerns were focused on drug interdiction and the migration issues. And migration in particular is something that's been top of mind for him. So in that regard, maybe they shouldn't have been such a total surprise. But I think what also is going on here is that we have a lot of leverage with Canada and Mexico. And that is, not only are we their largest trading partners, but 80% of Canadian and Mexican exports go to the U.S. market. And so, given we have a lot of leverage, he probably is thinking that these could be early wins for him in his overall policy, not only on trade, but migration too, and then he can turn to other countries. It hasn't exactly worked out that way because Canada in particular has been very vocal and has actually imposed its own retaliation against the U.S. Mexico has been a bit more measured, but we haven't solved these problems with Canada and Mexico yet.
And now maybe let's pivot to the U.S.-China relations. I think there has been some media reports coming out earlier this month that there might be a so-called birthday summit between Xi Jinping and Trump in July, around their birthdays. Given what has happened since, considering the U.S. has already slapped 20% tariffs on a blanket, Chinese goods, and this rate can even go higher, how likely do you think the birthday summit is at this point? And do you think there will be a so-called grand deal between U.S. and China? And please just help us unpack what the grand deal would entail if there is ever one.
Okay, those are some easy questions. Well, first, this birthday summit, apparently Trump and Xi Jinping, their birthdays are like a day off from each other.
Yeah, basically the same day if you consider the time
But
zone
the time difference. But the years are different, and I can't recall who's older, but I think it's President Trump. Yeah. So, from day one, the president has been, seems quite interested in holding a meeting with Xi Jinping. He mentioned early on that he was thinking of taking a trip to Beijing, which within his first 100 days in office. He's talked about this birthday summit. He mentioned to reporters earlier in the last week that there'll be news about Xi Jinping coming to the U.S., etc. I'm personally a little skeptical of this, and that's kind of based on the years I've worked with China and negotiating with China. And that is that China, in order to hold a summit with the president, will not want to risk any humiliation or surprises. It will want a very well orchestrated summit. And right now, things are a bit chaotic in that not only has China been hit by tariffs, but there are a number of other policy moves that China's not viewing favorably, including an expansion last week of our export control list and adding more Chinese entities to our export control list. Right now, we are considering high-level penalties on Chinese ships visiting the United States, which are also, pretty controversial, to those in Beijing. There is a policy that yet to be implemented to eliminate what's called the de minimis exception for small packages coming from China, and a new executive order limiting outbound and inbound investment from countries like China. And then when you put on top of it the so-called Liberation Day tariffs, that can include more tariffs against China. And in addition to the 20% tariffs you mentioned, China's also subject to the 25% tariffs on auto parts, steel, and aluminum. So, again, just going back to what I said earlier, I think that for Xi Jinping and for his aides around him, they're not going to risk a summit that isn't well orchestrated, and they have some confidence that things will end up in a better spot. And so I think what will be important to watch as a sign of whether a summit meeting may happen or not is whether high-level officials in his cabinet are speaking and meeting with their Chinese counterparts. We've seen some of that over the past week, but I think we need to see, many more meetings and conversations.
And if you take a guess, Wendy, during the Trump's first term with China, China and U.S. signed a so-called Phase 1 deal. Of course, according to Peterson Institute, China did not fulfill most of the purchase of the goods purchased. What do you think China wants now this time around? What does China want to demand from the U.S.?
Yeah. So if indeed the two sides agree to negotiate a Phase 2 deal, I think that both sides are going to have requests which are going to be difficult for the other side to meet. And so I think this would be an extremely difficult negotiation. From the U.S. perspective, I think they would like to not only get China to live up to its commitments in Phase 1, the Phase 1 agreement, but they'd probably seek building on the Phase 1 commitments, not just with respect to purchasing requirements, but also intellectual property protection, technology transfer, agriculture restrictions, etc. And then moreover, I think the United States would also want to find concrete ways to deal and curb the export of Chinese excess capacity, industrial excess capacity, to the United States. And that will be difficult. Some people are already talking about, and I'm one who is, that maybe we need to ask China to impose voluntary export restraints. That may just be the quickest way and the most, a way in which we'd have the most confidence that we won't be flooded with Chinese imports. Also, of growing concern to the United States are the activities of Chinese firms in third countries, particularly those activities which seem to be directed at avoiding U.S. tariffs. So, for example, Chinese companies have moved to Vietnam in the solar sector, where we imposed high tariffs from China, only to find out that the same Chinese companies moved their operations to Vietnam, exported from there, and therefore weren't subject to the China tariffs. So those are just some examples of what the U.S. might be seeking. China, on the other hand, will have its own list. And I think top on the list, they're going to want some kind of reduction of U.S. export controls on technology exports. They'll probably be looking for a rollback of all of these tariffs that Trump has either put in place or will be announcing. They'll probably want some guarantee that no further tariffs will be levied against them. And I think they'll also be very interested in opportunities for Chinese companies to invest in the United States. And I can't underscore how difficult all of those asks will be for the United States. And so while the two sides may be able to launch phase two negotiations, I don't think they can be concluded quickly if indeed they're going to be meaningful and tackle some of these really tough challenges.
So would you expect a slightly more curtailed version of phase two deal, given all the demands on both sides can be very tough to negotiate?
Yeah, I mean, it could be a deal which focuses, again, more on purchases and touches on these other issues. But I think, that will be difficult for the administration to come home with a deal that doesn't receive widespread support. Now, President Trump loves to call any deal that he's concluded the best deal ever, and that may convince a lot of his supporters that this deal, if concluded, is worthwhile. But again, I think there's so many challenges and also a skepticism about whether China will live up to these obligations, particularly given its mixed track record with respect to implementing and living up to the commitments of the Phase 1 agreement.
Let's maybe talk a little about the cost of tariffs and Trump's, trade policies. You mentioned, Wendy, that the USTR is proposing to impose hefty fees on China-built ships each time they dock at a U.S. port. And also, we've seen, forecasts on how U.S. inflation can tick upwards if Trump imposes more tariffs, not just on China, but on other countries. Do you really think Trump is willing to stick to his tariff plan, even at the risk of causing a recession in the U.S., which seems to be becoming a higher probability now than last week?
Well, I think the president is clearly trying to lower folks' expectations about at least what will happen in the short term in our economy. And he's basically said that we need to be prepared to accept some short-term pain in order to gain the benefits over the long term. So I think he's trying to get the American public ready. Look, there are a number of costs that can really stack up over time, and particularly in the immediate term. The first will be inflation. Prices will go up. I mean, the president loves to say that, well, no, the foreign government pays the tariff. That is not accurate. So what happens when a good comes into the United States, the importer on record, whether that be a distributor, whether that be like a Walmart type company or whoever, they're the ones who have to pay the tariff. So that's if a good is $100, the tariff is 25%. that importer then has to pay that extra $25. Now, the question then is, well, even though the importer has to pay, who absorbs all the costs of the $25? And frankly, there are three different folks that could, three different parties that could assume the cost. The first would be the importer. The importer just decides, I'll pay that $25. Second, the importer can go to the purchaser, whether that be a Walmart or an industrial consumer, and say, look, I've had to pay $25 more. I need you to pay an extra $10, let's say. And the importer can also go to the foreign supplier and say, if you want me to continue to sell your product, I need you to pay, let's say, $5. So the costs can be distributed, but it's the importer on record that pays, and it's not the foreign government that pays. If anyone pays, let's just say the foreign company, the supplier, might be asked, to pay for some of this. So now I forgot the rest of your question.
No worries. I guess what's the chance of a recession occurring due to the Trump policies right now?
Okay, so we had the prices going up. Second, the stock market, and the stock market's already responding, not only in the United States, but now in Asia and all over the world, to the so-called April 2nd Liberation Day. And so that's, number two. Number three, and people don't talk about this as much, is that what happens when there's a lot of uncertainty in the market, and that is very true given, the back and forth and the up and downs on Trump's tariff policy, what happens is the companies are reluctant to invest if they don't know what the trade landscape is going to look like. So, for example, if a U.S. company was interested in investing, let's just say, in Malaysia, and all of a sudden they're hearing or they're worried that Malaysia may be subject to high tariffs, they might want to reconsider that. But then if all countries are subject to these tariffs and there are negotiations going on and Trump is giving certain countries breaks, business investors may just say, you know what? I'm just going to wait until this all sorts out, because based on what's going on in the world, I don't know, how I want to organize my business operations. And when there's less investment, that directly impacts GDP, and that, could lead to a decline in GDP, which ultimately could lead to a recession. But I'm not predicting a recession. I just think these tariffs are going to have, spiraling costs to not only the U.S., but to the rest of the world. And then one more cost is potential retaliation from trading partners. So Canada and Europe, for example, have already imposed some retaliation and have announced they're going to be imposing more retaliation, largely so far in those countries raising their tariffs against U.S. exports. And that means that U.S. exporters also then are losing markets. And so that also impacts our economy. So overall, clearly in the short term, the economic costs are going to be a challenge. Whether over the long term it all kind of balances out and we're all fine remains to be seen.
Right, so lots of uncertainty. So you mentioned a little bit about like foreign investment into the U.S. and how that may get, how people may pause given the lack of clarity. Can you talk a little about the America First policy? Like, what does it mean for, say, investors in Asia, in particular in China and Hong Kong, say?
I'm sorry, what does it mean for investment?
In terms of foreign investment into the U.S.
Yeah, so, this is interesting because at times on the campaign trail, President Trump has talked about welcoming Chinese investment. But yet, just a few weeks ago, his administration issued an executive order instructing the Treasury Department, which is responsible for investment policy, to really tighten the screws on investments from certain countries, including China and the Hong Kong economy. At the same time, the executive order also asks for further restrictions on outbound investment from U.S. companies to certain countries as well. And so, it's hard to figure out how this is all going to work. But the trend seems to be that we're going to make it more difficult for Chinese and Hong Kong companies to invest in the United States. But again, since the president himself seems to be intrigued by having more Chinese investment, maybe he will, see to certain breaks with respect to investment in certain sectors. But I don't see investment in sensitive sectors that have to do with our national security. I don't think that's going to happen.
Right. And since, we're, not just China, but the rest of Asia is kind of bracing for the upcoming tsunami of Trump tariffs. So, I mean, given your background, Wendy, which countries do you think would stand to gain and which country would stand to lose? And how can they possibly prepare for, tariffs on the rest of the region?
So, who will gain and who will lose? I think for every country where I can talk about gains, there'll probably also be losses. If there's a universal tariff, then I think everyone will lose something, right? Because any exports to the U.S. will become more will be more expensive. But for example, if high tariffs are put on country X, then maybe exports from country Y will be more attractive and country Y will get a boost. But at the same time, for example, if the U.S., and I know this is a real concern in Southeast Asia, which is already experiencing, surges of Chinese exports in certain sectors, if the U.S. market closes and China keeps exporting its excess industrial capacity, it has to go somewhere. So the other markets like Southeast Asia may even see more Chinese imports. And so that's a loss to be, that needs to be calculated. And let's just remember, all these losses and benefits are not just limited to the trade area, right? We're talking about relationships between countries as well. And so I think this tariff policy is going to impact overall relationships.
One final question from me before we open up the floor. This is a bit of theoretical question, Wendy. So do you think Trump's drastic tariff policy will somehow drive, other countries to form multilateral ties that excludes the U.S. somehow? Can global trade still function without the U.S. playing a leading role?
Well, I think the short answer is yes, because there'll be no alternative, right? But even if the U.S. imposes all these tariffs, I think it's important to remember we're still a large trading country and we can't make everything at home. And even at this point, when relations between China and the U.S. are strained, there's still $600 billion of goods going both ways between our countries. And so I think that, trade will continue. We are beginning to see, though, that other countries, well, this started a while back, but we've seen these efforts accelerate. Countries are trying to diversify their trading partners and become less reliant on the United States. And we've seen a flurry of activity among, for example, the European Union now is accelerating and restarting its negotiations, free trade negotiations with India. The UK and India are moving forward with a trade agreement. Just this past week, late last week, the trade ministers from China, Japan, and Korea met. They've been working on an FTA for many years, but it seemed like they expressed interest in accelerating that work. And so I think we're going to see a lot more activity between our trading partners where they not raise tariffs, but they lower tariffs among themselves. And as a result, the United States will be disadvantaged because we'll still be subject to that higher tariff.
Right, great. Well, thanks so much, Wendy. Maybe we can start taking questions from the audience. Yes, this gentleman in the third row. Yes.
Thank you very much, Wendy. It's a wonderful insights into all sorts of things. Two questions, if I may. I'm a shipping guy, and the shipping levies on Chinese-built ships calling America sound completely bonkers, because they'll stop very good trades that are going on. A lot of American exporters won't be able to export their stuff. As you rightly say, the import will be passed on. The question I want to ask is, what arguments do you think this administration might listen to in trying to say that you can't just say it's economically crazy, because there's so many things that are economically crazy? So is there an argument that might work that you can think of? That was the first question. The second one is that we're trying to argue to the USTR that Hong Kong is not China. Hong Kong, one country, two systems. Hong Kong has a separate common law system, and so on and so on. I'm not sure whether the USTR listens to that, and do they actually take Hong Kong seriously as a separate from China, or not? I'd love your view. Thank you very much.
Okay, I guess we can take another question at the same time. Maybe this gentleman on the left side.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Brian. I teach philosophy at HKU. It's lovely to see you here, Wendy. Thank you for being in Hong Kong. My question concerns the model of decision-making adopted by Trump vis-a-vis tariffs, because it strikes me that lots of commentators are trying to read strategy and strategic elements into how the president is moving. But is there a worry that we might be over-reading into his actions? And maybe what's actually going on here is that we're watching the court politics unfold around an emperor with lots of clothes, I guess, but also a very short attention span. And given that, then what's the decision-making process in terms of the personnel and also the people involved in relation to tariff and trade policy determination? And what does this mean in terms of countries trying to respond to the court politics of America? Thank you.
Okay, Wendy.
Some easy questions. So first on the China shipbuilding matter. So just for let me just a teeny bit of background. Under the Biden administration, the USTR launched what's called a Section 301 investigation into Chinese shipbuilding practices. The Section 301 investigation, Section 301 is of our trade law, the 1974 Trade Act, basically requires an investigation into the practices, recommendations for actions to take to eliminate those practices. And so just a couple of months ago, or a month ago, it's very hard to keep track of time these days. Sometimes every day seems like a year. But USTR recommended that for China, steep fees for Chinese port calls for Chinese ships that are either operated or Chinese owned of over $1 million per port call to unload, their exports and pick up U.S. exports. The USTR, as required by the law, held a public hearing on these fees, and because there were so many comments, they needed 2 days of hearings. And frankly, the inputs were all over the map. A number of U.S. interests strongly supported these fees. Others pointed out all of the downsides and the craziness of such a recommendation, and how it will end up hurting not only global trade but hurt the United States. The USTR now needs to take all those views expressed during the hearing, but also during their public comment period, and now come up with a final recommendation for the president, who will either support USTR's finding or somehow adjust it. Technically the president can say, no, I don't even want to do this. That's highly unlikely. So I don't know exactly where we're headed here, but I think we're going to see some version of the USTR recommended action. With respect to Hong Kong being treated separately from China for trade purposes, as I'm sure many of you noted, that the tariffs that Trump put on China during his first term did not apply to Hong Kong. But this time around, when he applied 2 different intervals of 10% tariffs, these tariffs now are being applied to Hong Kong as well. Now that is the U.S. policy. I would just clarify, it's not just USTR's policy, it's the policy of the U.S. government now, which views basically, it's hard to distinguish between Hong Kong and China for the purposes of these tariffs. And then finally, on the strategic thinking in Washington, and whether we're overreading all of this. Look, with any policy, I'll just tell you a story. When I used to negotiate trade agreements, sometimes we made decisions that were made for reasons that our trading partner really, they just couldn't understand why we were making a certain decision. And later on, when we, after we reached a deal and we'd kind of sit down and have a drink and talk about some stuff, our trading partners somehow would assign all of this strategic thinking that we thought through everything. We knew exactly what we were doing. And, I would share with them, no, basically someone, the USTR had to go home by 8 o'clock that night. So we needed to make a quick decision and this was it. So I don't want to, all I'm saying is this always happens in life and in policy, whether a lot of these policies are well thought out or they more tactical or seat of the pants. I would say that our president tends to be a bit more impulsive than at least President Biden. President Biden was, very methodical in his decision making. And sometimes was criticized for taking too much time. I mean, people, when I think about the tariffs we put on against China during Trump's first term, there was to be a 4-year review on whether to keep those tariffs or increase them. And I think the Biden administration took about 2 years to conduct that review. And so, you can be criticized for being too deliberate or being too quick. But in any event, we are where we are.
Yes, this gentleman. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Wendy. I don't feel any better, but at least I feel more informed. You mentioned inflation, and obviously you mentioned Walmart, and we mentioned Target and Costco. Is there a trigger point where this is going to start to affect politically? You had to be concerned when you were negotiating too about that as well, and for farmers as well who could get retaliatory tariffs and who have been hit by what happened with AID as well, and many other areas. Many of them voted for Trump and voted for the administration. Is there a trigger point, do you think, that it could turn, or are we past that now? Are we in a different era?
Great. Let's take one more question on the back, maybe. Gentleman on the back. Thanks.
Yeah. So the two stated objectives of tariffs are illegal immigration, drugs. The second one is to get manufacturing jobs to the U.S. Given that most governments in the world today want to upgrade and create more services jobs, is there a logic to try and create more, what I would argue is lower paying blue collar jobs instead of more services jobs, which are typically better paying?
Okay, let's take one more, and then Wendy will answer. Okay, this lady up front, thanks.
Thank you, Wendy and Stella, today for your time. So I just want to ask about the financial markets. In terms of, so you talked about how there may be potentials of companies pulling out and the government imposing certain restrictions on investments, particularly in, for example, between U.S., China, U.S. and other countries. And so in terms of the timeline and sort of the stress that these businesses could take, is there a possibility of a divergence or a pulling out of these U.S. companies, investment companies from Hong Kong even? And how long do you think this will have to go on without resolving to allow that to happen? And then the second part's about the sustainability. So we know Trump's feelings around sustainable investments, and a lot of it's also related to supply chain discrepancies and efficiencies. And so how much of that is going to be affected as well? Thank you.
Okay, so first, the question on inflation and, at what point, does this become, an issue that leads people to question their support of the president? I don't know, we'll see. When I think of what, in terms of the calendar, I think we need to keep in mind our November midterm election. A year from November, it seems a long time off, but that's, the right now our Congress, the Republicans lead both houses of the Congress, but the House, the Republican margin is very low. There's some key House races that are being held right now, and some of them are a lot closer than the Trump team had hoped for. And as many of you probably read, he has asked his nominee for the UN, a Congresswoman, Stefanik, to no longer go to the UN, but to stay in the House because they need her vote. And so I think that will be kind of the earliest kind of referendum on these policies. But again, if people start seeing these price increases across the board, not only just at Target and Walmart, but with respect to auto tariffs, the estimates are all over the map, but I've seen estimates from an extra $3,000 to $8,000 per car. And for cars that people are driving, trying to get replacement auto parts also being extremely expensive. And I think you made a great point when you combine this with our farmers taking a hit, because when countries retaliate against the United States, they don't retaliate necessarily on the same products. They pick the products that are going to hurt the United States the most, and the products in states where they're hoping that the legislatures and the governors will become active and lobby the White House. Now, under Trump 1.0, when the farmers were hurt, the president then turned around and offered them additional financial assistance in the tens of billions of dollars. He may need to do that again. But I think that we all, people will be watching the public's reactions to price increases very closely. And that, it could lead the president to decide that maybe trying to negotiate with countries becomes a more attractive proposition rather than keeping some of these tariffs in place. Now I can't read my handwriting. The second question, about services and manufacturing jobs. Yeah, so look, the president loves manufacturing, and he thinks we need to be making more stuff in the United States, whether it be steel or autos or whatever. And that's a priority of his. It doesn't mean he's not interested in services jobs, but clearly manufacturing is something on his mind. And then finally, with respect to investment restrictions, look, when companies invest or when companies decide to pull out of a country or to build their next plant elsewhere, they take many factors into consideration, right? They'll look at the policy environment, including tariffs and regulations, but they also look at the workforce. They look at the overall relationship between the two economies. And, again, they look at the market and a whole host of factors. And so I think, the same will take place with respect to the decision process in the boardrooms in the United States, will take many factors into consideration, and we'll have to determine what makes the most sense for them as a company and in response to their shareholders. Look, we've already seen in China, many U.S. companies either leaving or deciding when they build their next plant or they think of their next product, maybe they'll go to Southeast Asia, not China. So it doesn't mean you actually have to pull out your investments. It could be with respect to new investments, you diversify. But again, these are company decisions, and I don't think like tariffs themselves are going to be a determinative factor. I think they'll weigh into any company's decision, but again, they'll consider a lot of different elements as they make investment decisions.
Thanks. Okay, we can take three more. This gentleman in the middle, and you. Thanks.
Hello, I'm an undergraduate student who studies politics, and my question is about the use of history to legitimize economic policies. In the BRI project, there's strong images to the glorious Tang dynasty of China and the overland Silk Roads and the maritime Silk Routes. What historical imaginary guides the Trump tariff policy?
Okay, if we can pass, mic to this, next to Brian. Thanks.
So Bloomberg before the weekend had a take on this, which was that the U.S. is moving from a rules-based system to a deals-based system, and all of the risks that come with that. Yet it's also true that it's not like the Biden administration, they were challenging things at the WTO and undercutting some of those dispute mechanisms, kind of even during that administration. So I guess you answered earlier about kind of can global trade survive without the U.S. I might tweak that question slightly and ask, can the current rules-based global trading system survive without the U.S.?
Okay, let's take one more. This lady, here on the left.
I'm a student from City ASHK, and my question is, what do you think about Li Ka-shing's recent sale of overseas ports to the United States? And is it an activity driven by political factors? And what impact will this have on China's overseas trade? And besides, I think the impact of the mainland will also be transmitted to Hong Kong, and the mainland and Hong Kong cannot be separated to be talked. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe the first one on the. Oh yeah. I guess you're asking about the Li Ka-shing, C.K. Hutchison's divestment of some of the ports to BlackRock recently, including two that's over the Panama Canal. Yeah. Okay.
This audience is really making me work. I gotta go try my. Okay, so the question about history and how is that how is that playing into Trump's thinking? Actually, I thought I knew trade policy, and frankly, the president is naming a bunch of presidents in the 1800s who used tariffs for some of the same reasons that he's interested in using tariffs. And so I think he looks at American history, and he looks at, he applauds the presidents that have been supportive of tariffs, but he's also extremely critical of presidents that have lowered tariffs and participated in negotiations like the TPP and other negotiations that I not only participated in, but helped shape. So yeah, that's on that. So the question on the rules-based system, first I would say when the president talks about the so-called Liberation Day on April 2nd, when he's scheduled to announce these reciprocal tariffs, which may now be universal tariffs, and he talks about maybe announcing some sectoral tariffs, he also phrases this will be our liberation, our freedom from the rules-based order on trade. And the rules-based order on trade is really embodied by the World Trade Organization and GATT, its predecessor. The U.S. was not only a founder of this system, but a strong supporter and a leader of the system for many, many years. However, and I'll just say personally, one of my first jobs with the government was working on Geneva on GATT and WTO issues. So I don't say this lightly. I was a strong supporter of this organization, but I think with time it is increasingly becoming irrelevant. And part of the problem is that it operates on a consensus-based principle, meaning all countries have to be on board with any results of a negotiation or even to launch a negotiation, etc. And so any one country of the 166 members can block anything. And that's basically what we've seen in the WTO. For many years, they had successive, what are called negotiating rounds, where trade was liberalized. But the last round that was launched in 2001, called the Doha round, never saw the light of day. And since then, while there have been a few negotiating successes on issues like trade facilitation or fish subsidies, for the most part, the WTO hasn't been able to produce new agreements. And, with that, countries, not just the U.S., but other countries too, have decided either to forge WTO plus agreements among themselves or to ignore WTO rules. And again, the United States is not alone here. I just read this morning, and I think the FT, that for this past year, the number of WTO dispute settlement cases launched against China comprised almost half of all the dispute settlement cases this year. And, look, they haven't been adjudicated. I don't know if China, adhered to the rules or not. But the point I want to make is everyone points to the U.S. as not adhering to the WTO rules. But in fact, many countries have just, decided either they're going to push the boundaries or that these rules no longer address the challenges that are facing them in the trading system. The U.S., we are not withdrawing from the World Trade Organization. I think it's quite interesting that at USTR there are 3 deputies, one of them to be our ambassador to the WTO, and that's the only nomination so far that has been made by the administration of the 3 deputies, the ambassador to the WTO. And I would argue, if people think we're going to withdraw from the WTO, why would we then go ahead and announce a nomination of an ambassador? But that said, we're not happy with the WTO now, but I don't think we're alone. But the challenges in terms of trying to improve it, frankly, to me, seem out of reach at this point. I don't think this means the WTO is going to be, will no longer exist. I think it will continue to exist, but it may look more and more like APEC or like the UN, where it becomes more of a talk forum and trying to work with countries to resolve differences, but not an organization that's going to deal with emerging challenges by writing new trade rules. I think that's just getting extremely difficult. And finally, on the ports developments, I think the only thing I really want to say on this is that I think it's really clear that the Hong Kong company is being really, it's under pressure from 2 superpowers in terms of what to do. And I hope that there's some sweet spot that can be reached, because I would not personally want to be in that position. It's a very difficult decision to make. And I hope it doesn't mean that other companies going forward are going to be facing the same types of pressures, but I'm afraid that that might be in the cards.
Great. I guess we can take maybe one more questions. I know we're close to the end of. Yeah, can we get Louis here?
Thank you for giving me this space, Stella. Wendy, when the Biden administration started, some people thought that probably those tariffs that the Trump administration, the first one, put on, probably they will go down or go away. That didn't happen, and new ones came up. Like, is it at all, from a political economy perspective, could it, I mean, what do you think? Like, is it at all possible to see tariffs coming down at some point in 6, 7, 8, 9 years? Or are they likely to just ratchet up? And then secondly, you talked a little bit about what is happening in the US, what that may mean for other countries. There are incentives to maybe not join, and there are also incentives to just join and also ramp up tariffs. Do you think that what's happening in the US is likely to just drive up tariffs across the board globally?
So, one point we haven't really discussed is that all of these tariffs that Trump's talking about are cumulative. You'll also hear the word stacked or additive. So, for example, let's just take China right now. I think about 60% of their tariff lines are subject to the 25% tariff from Trump 1.0. And then you add on the 20% percentage points that were announced early, last month. So that means Chinese tariffs at 45%. But then if it's steel, aluminum, or auto parts, that would take your tariffs up another 25%. And then if they're reciprocal tariffs and you add that on, you really get to a zone where, at least with respect to China, our tariffs are approaching, in some products, close to 100%. And at that point, or close to that point, tariffs become what are called prohibitive, that it's not even worth trading or exporting. So my view is, and particularly if we're going to enter a new trade negotiation with China, I think both sides are going to need to find a way to lower some of these tariffs. Because if you keep adding on and adding on, I mentioned earlier one of Trump's objectives is to raise revenue. Well, you're not going to raise any revenue if there's no trade. And so I think there is a possibility. Biden also, not only did he maintain the Trump tariffs, but he also, in a very surgical way, increased tariffs on batteries, electric vehicles, and some other goods from China. So again, I think hopefully there's a way to bring them down, but I wouldn't expect we're going to get back to where we were before Trump 1.0 anytime soon on tariffs. Your other question had to deal with, are other countries going to follow what we do with respect to tariffs? I think that's a clear possibility. For example, when Biden increased our electric vehicle tariff against China to 100%, not long after that, Canada did the same thing. And so I think there will be, certain countries will either choose to follow the U.S. or decide, well, wait a second, if the U.S. can get away with this, why don't we raise our tariffs too? So that is a distinct possibility. But that said, many other countries, particularly smaller and medium-sized countries, they value the rules of the WTO. And so I've been surprised that more countries haven't raised their tariffs, but I think many small and medium-sized countries feel they're better off trying to get everyone adhere to the WTO rules versus violating them and then being subject to more tariffs.
Great. I think that's all the time we have today. Thanks so much, Wendy, again, for your inputs and insights, and thanks everyone for being here.
On behalf of Asia Society Hong Kong, I want to thank Wendy and Stella and all of you for being here. By the way, there are still seats left for tomorrow's lunch program. So if you are interested, please sign up. The Trump 2.0 perspective from Asia, and you'll hear from Professor Lavali Nasser, Ambassador Chen Hongqi, and our President Kyung-Hwa Kang. So feel free to sign up for tomorrow's program, but thank you all for being here. Again, Wendy, thank you. And so look forward to seeing you at future programs. Good evening.